Thank you all for coming out on this rainy night, and thank both of you for having the conversation with me tonight. My first question is maybe easy or maybe a little tricky, but it's actually, when did you first encounter Roy Lichtenstein's work? Daniel, you want to go?
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. It's a really honor to be here. So it's like setting me down on this psychological rabbit hole down memory lane. And I guess the first image I had in mind had nothing to do with Lichtenstein per se, but I was a big fan of like the Adam West Batman TV show growing up, and just I feel like I was suffused in like Lichtenstein's culture in a way before I even saw the painting or even maybe knew what art was. So I think by the time I might have seen this first painting, and it's hard to really say exactly when that was, I grew up in the suburbs of New York, so my parents did take me into the city. So I probably saw a painting at the Whitney or MoMA or something like that, but it just felt like growing up in the 80s, it was just Lichtenstein come to life and on television and everywhere else. So,
He's kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't remember where I first, well, it was the mic, where I first saw his work exactly, but my very first museum job, if you could even call that, was an internship at the Dallas Museum of Art. I grew up in Dallas, and I was in high school, and I was like an education assistant on a show of the Prince of Roy Lichtenstein. And with the school kids, we put tracing paper on top of reproductions of Lichtenstein images and take little dot stickers like those red, stickers and blue, and we'd make Lichtensteins with the kids. So I definitely have been thinking about his work. I don't know how old I am now. It's scary to say 30 years. And I remember also being in love with that big drowning girl painting in MoMA's collection. And they used to make an incredible poster of that was like 3 feet square, and showing up with it at my freshman year college dorm, much to the horror of my roommates, who were probably like, oh my God, who's this guy with this giant thing in the common room? But it's been with me for a long time now.
And I asked the question in part because he really is an artist that's everywhere in our society. And I think it's also a question of legacy, because, I feel like you both have something to do with legacy and touch points for artists in the world aren't always just in museums. And so on the occasion of the centenary, which is this October, when Roy would have turned 100, I was curious about legacy. And Scott, I'm going to ask you a question first, because the Roy Lichtenstein estate recently gave a very lovely gift to the Whitney Museum of Art. And it was actually the studio buildings that the estate had formerly, it was actually Roy's studio when he was alive, and they preserved it actually quite, so you could see the way his canvases would turn and hang on the walls when he was making them. And what does a gift like that, along with prints and other drawings that they gave the Whitney, what's the impact of that gift sort of on students and on the Whitney?
Yeah, so I think I think it's going to be an incredible impact. We have had at the Whitney for more than 50 years something called the Independent Study Program, which is a non-degree granting educational sort of arm of the Whitney Museum that trains curators, critics, and artists, mostly artists actually, in a kind of interdisciplinary dialogue. And it's an incredible program. It's had one director for the first 54 years of its existence until just the end of last year, but it never had a permanent home. It had been sometimes in the museum, in rented quarters downtown. And I think Dorothy Lichtenstein, Roy's widow, and the family, as they began to think about what to do with the building that was Roy's studio and the adjacent townhouse, which is just a few blocks from the Whitney, had an idea that they didn't want to make it a kind of Roy Lichtenstein memorial, that would be somehow not really what Roy would have wanted. Obviously, he's been dead now several decades, but the idea that it could be a home to future generations of artists and a place of kind of creative renewal and inspiration for young people really excited Dorothy, and that we were moving so close was going to be like just a perfect coincidence. So there was really a three-legged approach maybe to celebrating the centennial or anticipating it, that there would be this school, the gift of the ISP building, or the studio which would house the ISP, and then an exhibition to celebrate the centennial. You heard in the introduction that the show is still 3 years off, so we're kind of missing that due to the pandemic and other things, but we will be cutting the ribbon the week that Roy would have turned 100, the last week of October. So we're really excited to be moving the students in the fall, and I think it's going to be a great chapter for the ISP.
And Daniel, you're the executive director of the Al Held Foundation, and I wonder if you can think of any touch points of what they've done well.
Yeah,
Over the.
I can really answer that probably from like two perspectives. One is a curator, because I was before I became the director of the Held Foundation, I was the curator of the Dorsky Museum at SUNY New Paltz, and I was working on an exhibition about Dick Kolich, who is the founder of the Talix Art Foundry, which worked extensively with Roy. And so in talking to Dick, we isolated the certain number of artists that were most important to him in his collaborations, and Roy was certainly one of them. And so the next step was for me to approach the foundation, where I had never had any contact with them before, and I was coming from, kind of a small, like, state university museum. I didn't know what the response would be, but I was like welcomed with open arms and, invited to visit the foundation, join the staff for lunch, had extensive time in the archives. Not only was I able to borrow one, beautiful bronze, but all the related drawings and studies for that bronze. So the word really is like generosity. And that was sort of my experience as a curator. And then that kind of set the bar for how I felt like I wanted to behave, in my role at the Held Foundation, but also even seeing how other ways the Lichtenstein Foundation has operated. They had placed these huge collection of photographs by the Schunk-Kander estate, like 200,000 or something like that, in other public institutions. So I think it's a gift that goes beyond, Lichtenstein and his legacy. So like, I guess like what Scott was saying, not a memorial to one person. And just to add on top of that, in this research I was doing for the Dick Kolich show, and I discovered this whole trove of papers related to Talix that were not in Dick's possession, they were in someone else's possession. And the owner wanted to get rid of them and place them somewhere. And the first person that I thought to go to was Jack, because the foundation had this track record of placing other important archives. And so, and he took them on, and now they're the archives of American art. So I think that's another extended legacy for Lichtenstein through the foundation.
I would agree with everything you just said. I spent quite a bit of time in the archives over the years making different books related to Roy Lichtenstein, and I could tell they really were amazing in the materials they would gather and how they would let people come in and just sift through things and find things for themselves, but also they would guide you towards certain drawings or related. And that's so helpful in scholarship, and it really helps you shape the stories you're telling around an artist. And I think that they are really exemplary among artist foundations for how organized they are and just how generous. I think that was the perfect word, actually. Scott, you're planning a retrospective at the Whitney. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I'll know a very little bit, or maybe something about the approach to this show. I actually have been thinking about doing this show for some time, for several years. Not me personally, the Whitney, when I in my chief curator hat, and I think something that is a starting point for me when I think about a show like this at an institution like the Whitney, and it was true also of the Jasper Johns retrospective that we did. It was just 2 years ago, and that I did curate. Is that I don't take for granted that for our audience, this show is like a home run. And I think it's important. It's not a criticism of Lichtenstein. It's that in order to think an artist like him into a contemporary space, whatever we mean by that, contemporary moment, for an audience that's younger, for a city that hasn't had a Lichtenstein retrospective, and it'll be 30 years at that point, quite a long time since the Guggenheim show in the mid-90s, is to think about how, if you don't take for granted that everyone assumes that he's like one of the greatest artists, which maybe I don't take that for granted, that everyone assumes that, not that he isn't, then it puts you in a place to think hard and kind of force yourself to reinvent the approach to the artist's work and to make it meaningful in the present moment. And for me, doing that meant bringing an artist on board who would help with that. And so I'm co-curating the show with Alex DeCorte, which was actually the great idea of my former colleague David Breslin, who's now at the Met. And Alex I don't know how many of you know his work, but he's an artist who's close in age to me-ish, probably a bit younger, was in the last Whitney biennial, makes work that feels a bit Lichtenstein-inspired and has a kind of obsession with Lichtenstein. And if you go to his studio in Philadelphia, he's got every book, all the ephemera. I think it's pretty unusual to imagine. I can't think of a precedent for it, but if any of you know, please tell me, because I don't like claiming something's unprecedented, to think of really like co-curating a straight-up retrospective with a young artist. It won't be straight up because it'll be kind of wild because Alex is doing it, but this is not like one of those artist choice shows where you ask an artist to come and like dig around in your collection. I think we're all familiar with those kind of exhibitions, but to say, hey, Alex DeCorte, do you want to help get loans from all around the world and we're going to come up with $1 billion of insurance or wherever it'll end up, and you're going to be like at the table the way we imagine senior art historians or major museum curators to help shape this story. And the third person in that conversation is Meg Onley, who is one of the co-curators of this year's biennial, and she's our curator at large. She lives in LA. She's worked mostly with younger and historical Black artists, has a really interesting perspective on things, and we thought this is going to be like not your usual Lichtenstein curatorial crew. And I know that the show will be kind of wild and kind of stagey, and it will not look like a normal retrospective that people might imagine, nor did the Jasper John show. But beyond that, I don't want to share too much because it's still kind of in formation, but it has to feel like really alive at its moment. And I think as like so-called pop art ages, it just gets further and further from like a lived vernacular experience of anybody. You know, comic books don't look like they used to anymore. People are thinking about the duplication of images so differently than in Lichtenstein's day. So if you start by imagining what that gap is in maybe the audience's relationship to the work and how it used to be understood or perceived, that to me is a productive starting point.
You're also at this moment in the planning where, you know, the more you dig in, the more you learn. And there's so much about Roy's practice that I think people, they think they know the work. And actually there's a lot of series that really aren't very well known or documented. Even, you know, as established as he is, I think there's something to be learned still. And just speaking on that topic a little bit, you know, we have a sculpture exhibition uptown right now. And you wrote for the catalog, and I thought it might be interesting. You know, Roy made sculptures throughout his entire life, and I'm not sure it's the work that everybody knows when that first comes to mind when you say, you know, Roy Lichtenstein. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit about your thoughts on the sculpture and how they play into Roy's overall practice.
Yeah. I mean, the sculptures are remarkable, and right, he is known as a painter, but he also showed, you know, his first New York show in 1951, you know, more memorable for certain paintings that have like this real kind of school of Paris feel to them and look to them, but also kind of telling these narratives of American history and European history and mythology. But there are also these sculptures, these carved wooden totemic figures and these little assemblages, which equally caught the eye of the viewers and the critics and kind of exposed this broader way of thinking that he had about the world, and how I think he must have had like a puzzle or a problem that he was trying to resolve, you know, formally, and was toggling between, you know, what we think of as 2 dimensions, painting and drawing, and 3 dimensions, which is, you know, working with more physical material. And you just see that throughout his career. But I think he did sort of take this break in the early 60s when the sculpture did fall back. And that's, of course, when he became the great pop painter that we know him as. But if you then look back at a lot of those paintings, there are these isolated figures on an all-white ground. So they're still floating in space, and there's still a sort of an objecthood to his imagery. And so it wasn't sort of a very far stretch for him to then get back into sculpture making, but using this new visual language of the Ben-Day dots and the hard black lines and the primary colors and sort of that comic book style. And I appreciate your point about how comics have evolved. So whatever the comic book style was, you know, at that time when he was working. So it's interesting to me, like you look back at a show in
Castelli Gallery, 1965, he showed the brushstroke paintings, which are rightfully celebrated, but also these ceramic teacups and saucers, which he found to be very novel and humorous because, it's sort of like a Johnsian kind of or Duchampian kind of joke is like, what's the art and what's the useful object? And so can you create a functional work of art, really? And so I think there's that visual play and the material haptic play that he was starting to explore in the 60s, and then it just evolves. And I'm particularly fond of the bronze pieces because that was sort of my starting point, really, in studying Lichtenstein's sculpture and appreciating kind of the embedded inherent absurdity that he was interested in, because you can look at some of these pieces and you have pretty straight lines, not all of them and some of them, and they kind of read almost as these bars. And so, but initially he went to a fabricator, to Lippincott, and with his models or his designs, and for some reason they weren't able to fabricate them to his specifications, and he had a model maker or the studio assistant at the time. He said, well, there's another way to do it, and that by making it in bronze, he could have the actual one-to-one wooden maquette that then would be cast in, the mold would be made and then it would be cast into bronze, and it would more perfectly replicate, all the edges and the refined detailing that for some reason the fabricator wasn't able to realize. So it's this great irony that you have these ephemeral materials or these translucent forms such as glasses of water or steam rising off of a coffee cup, yet they're rendered in this very, very heavy material like bronze, which is usually used for monumental sculpture with this beautiful patina, and it has a sense of heroic value to it, but then for him it's covered in paint and you don't see that it's bronze at all. So I think that, again, the absurdity, the irony is just embedded into the materiality in a way that's, I think, very unusual for any artist. So
I love that, the ephemeral moment frozen in bronze. They're like drawings in space also. They're kind of quite two-dimensional, but yet they really are engaging.
They're not like drawings. They
are drawings.
Sorry, that's the... Well, no, they're not drawing, but... I was looking at this show and the way that they're all turned to address you, I kind of love the staginess of that. And then you come up to them and the base of these cups makes no sense at all. I'm like, this is where the artist got stuck. He didn't know how to stand them up, because you look at all the collages and the maquettes and it's like they're totally conceived in elevation. And the ellipse that's showing you the top of the cup and the water, of course, is flat. But at some point it meets a plane at, a 90-degree angle. And it's like, that's where the base is getting why didn't he just sink them in like an Ellsworth Kelly totem or something? But the sort of perversity of that gesture in that moment is what is so kind of weird and nutty about them. And it's the same thing when you're talking about the teacups. It's like they're covered with Ben-Day dots. They're real objects that have cast shadows painted on them. But Jasper Johns' ale cans, the shadow is whatever the shadow in the room is. It's like he didn't do a cast shadow on half the can. Mm-hmm. And it's that idea of, I'm somebody who is thinking so hard about the way representation works in 2 dimensions that if I'm going to pull it into 3 dimensions, that's the tension in the sculpture.
I'm going to transition to a different body of work, but Roy Lichtenstein made quite a few murals during his lifetime, and one of them is actually on view on West 24th Street right now. And it's based on an Oscar Schlemmer painting that's actually in MoMA's collection and on view as well. And I was curious, Scott, you wrote about the Times Square mural a few years ago. Sorry, I hope you're... I got it this morning, but...
God.
But I was curious, your thoughts about the importance of his murals, because I also find the murals are often where a lot of his imagery comes together, especially the Green Street mural in particular. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you thought about the murals in a while and if you have any thoughts about how they lay.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think they're an interesting and maybe somewhat vexing aspect of his work in a way. If you think about the early pop work, there's like this single like gestalt of like the comic book cell or maybe a diptych from an ad or something, and it doesn't really scale up. You know, maybe that drowning girl I'm mentioning at MoMA gets a little bit bigger, but it's not the works that get big in the 60s are landscapes, like the big horizon, something that has a kind of dumb repeat, like an entablature. It's not like this is a person composing Las Meninas or the School of Athens or like a multi-part composition that fills the space in a certain way, because it's almost constitutionally like anathema to the way that he's like scanning an image culture. And so when he's working at big scale like this, the approach is often like this agglomerative, like scrapbook vibe, where he's like taking a bunch of ideas that he has had before and sort of assembling them across this plane. And I think that is a very interesting, it's closer to Rauschenberg almost in a funny way, this kind of idea of how you add things together and they fill space. And it doesn't then surprise me that it has this kind of anthological, self-anthologizing mode. You see that in some of the late Warhol paintings too, in a funny way, that he made just before he died. So it feels like it's a little bit like not his natural way of constructing a space or putting a single picture together, that then forces him into something that he doesn't do most often in most of his paintings. And I like that idea, because it's like, okay, how does this large-scale format force an artist to deal differently with like their own bag of tricks or something? And I do think also the publicness and the accessibility of these works is interesting to think about in relation to like a pop artist, or how you think about audience like that. So I think there's still maybe more digging to do around them, and I'd love to see at the Whitney. I'm sure we will have some big mural. I won't give away the...
So when he's bringing together imagery, you know, it's his own imagery, but he's also always looking at art history. I mean, I feel like his knowledge of art history is just so deep, and it comes into his practice so frequently. And, you know, he's made paintings after Picasso, you know, German Expressionism, Chinese landscapes, still lives. And I just wanted to know your thoughts, both of you actually, about the influence that you see in terms of earlier artists on his work. Maybe Daniel.
Yeah, no, I think it's omnipresent. He didn't have, my feeling is he didn't have an Oedipal relationship with the early modernists in the way that other American artists had. And I think that's like a real important distinction, that he found that there was a real usable past in classical modernism, whether it's, you know, Picasso or Mondrian or Brancusi. I mean, just go down the list. They were all like grist. Yeah, Matisse, thank you. Really grist for the mill. And I think that he saw that there was still potential there for adaptation and revision and reanalysis, and you know, going back to that sort of that break in the 1940s with surrealism and the abstract expressionists went the automatist roots and towards this like total image field. And I think for artists like Lichtenstein to like hold on to the image, you know, to still have meaning, and even his abstractions look like images of abstractions, that they don't look like, you know, sort of pure abstractions in the same way that Pollock or de Kooning conceptualized their work. And so, you know, I was in contemplating some of this earlier. It just feels like there's a sense of him wanting to like hold on to civilization in a way as having some inherent value or some inherent good, and that it's this museological approach to, I mean, we talk about art history, but it's not sort of this universal art history that he was responding to. It's like very specific, but I think it was museological art history, like what he may have encountered in New York museums or other museums, you know, in his travels, and that those are the pieces that he responds to. So Schlemmer did other stairways, but I guess, you know, Lichtenstein didn't go to like, you know, Stuttgart to see the others. He saw the one that was at MoMA because that's his living world, his living art history.
Yeah, so many of his citations are in New York institution,
right?
Actually.
Yeah, well, no, I agree with everything you said, Daniel. And I think maybe the only thing I would add to it is that it would be easy or fun or sort of rewarding to make a show of like Lichtenstein art history, and I'm sure it's been done and there's books and things about it, and you put like the things that look like the things that Lichtenstein painted. And if I were doing that show, I wouldn't do it this way. I would pick the kind of like conceptual pivots that I think Lichtenstein so brilliantly understood from art history. Like, what is he doing when he's thinking about cubism in works that don't look at all like they have anything to do with cubism, which is essentially a semiotic inquiry about how you put a picture together and how you make different kind of marks represent the things you're picturing from the world. Like, the way that Picasso in the teens is using, printed papers and playing with dots. And, if you think about the absinthe glass next to those teacups you mentioned, that would be really interesting to me. Or to play around with some of these Duchampian ideas. Of course, the ready-made, Lichtenstein's repainting these paintings, so they're not just ready-mades, but there's a kind of like linguistic and conceptual gambit, in the early work. If you think of the before and after screen, or some of these works, and I would think it would be interesting almost to do a show of things that didn't quite look like one another, that was challenging people to say, wow, Lichtenstein's digging like really deep here. And actually, to some degree, the things that look like the Lichtenstein version of the other artist's work are the ones that interest me less in that conversation. And maybe I find, maybe with the exception of the like Abex pictures, the brushstrokes, because I think that there's like a real like leap there in terms of what he's doing with, the idea of de Kooning. But otherwise, or you would do things like take Barnett Newman's The Wild and put it next to one of the entablatures, like a really forced or extruded kind of shape. I think there's more to it than maybe some of these comparisons suggest, I would say.
I think that's very astute, actually, and super interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. He really does dig deep. He really, really studies in something, and then he makes it a part of himself, and then he puts it out in different ways. Thinking about Roy as a person, I don't think any of us had the opportunity to meet him, unfortunately, but, there's a lot of humor everywhere in the work, and he works serially. He seemed to be, he kept the same hours in the studio all the time. I've been told stories about how he ate lunch at the same place, and he always finished a body of work well before the show and was already working on the next series when the show opened. And I just wondered, spending so much time looking at the work, if either of you have heard some of those same stories and thought about how Roy as a person may be coming through in some of the work.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing really is like a consummate professional. When I think of someone as a professional, they're responsible to other people. There's sort of like every profession has an ethic to it and an ethical responsibility. And if you don't uphold that ethical responsibility, well, maybe you lose your license, depending on what that profession might be, or maybe it's just not the right choice for you and you should find some other profession. And so I think that idea of like fairness and responsibility, to this profession that he chose, of being an artist, and understanding that it's just not him, the grand genius, alone in his studio, but there's assistants, there's secretaries, there's, people in the gallery, people, shipping, elsewhere, you name it. Everyone, a lot of people are touching these works. There's many hands involved. And so I think that kind of that larger consciousness of, his role in the world, I think kind of undergirds the practice that we were talking about. And so, talking about Florent, I mentioned to someone I work with at the foundation that I was going to be coming here and being on this panel, and she used to work at Florent in the 90s and didn't serve Roy, but worked the night shift, but she had friends who did, and the stories that she always heard from the server's point of view is how, affable and generous and kind he was, and how, he was a pleasure to have there. And so I think that was like very, very encouraging to hear. And then just to see that sensibility is maintained, by the foundation and also the estate too. I mean, I think the estate has been extraordinarily generous and in the work that they do as well. So that's part of the answer to your question. I can go on, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree with what you're saying, and I feel like I met him a few times. We certainly did not know each other well when I was like a student, but the work looks to me like the work of someone who ate the same thing for lunch every day. That there's a way of making work that allows you to like put down your brush, go to lunch, come back, like punch out at 5. It's a workman-like approach to making a painting. You plan it all out, you fill it all in. This is not someone who was like, oh my God, if I put the brush down now, I'm going to lose, this weird color that I've mixed on my palette, which is a true thing for painters, or like the Kooning sticking newspaper all over his like wet things at night. And if you don't finish this section, it's going to dry funny. This is an approach to making work. And there's a lot of great artists who've done this, throughout their careers. In fact, we have a show like that right now at the Whitney of Ruth Asawa's drawings, and probably no one would really think of Ruth Asawa's drawings and Lichtenstein's paintings in the same like thought bubble, but there is something about the work of them. She was like, had to invent a drawing practice that like let her juggle having 6 children under the age of 9 so that she could draw when she had insomnia or whatever and put the pencil down and then pick it back up. And so it feels methodical like that. And it doesn't surprise me if he was a guy who like lived a certain kind of life that was pretty organized and not like going crazy. So I see that in the work, some kind of sense of order, and like you begin at the beginning and you end at the end, and there's not a lot of like decision making to do in the middle.
And he's funny, and the work is very funny. And also in my touch points on the work, I always see some of the early drawings, and it's always remarkable to me how much the finished piece looks like a sketch he made that's very casual, and he just evolved it either in scale, or you can see it changing slightly based on the material. Also, I think in terms of, he returns to sculpture over time. He returns to printmaking sort of once a year. He goes out to LA and makes prints with Gemini, and the following year he does it again. And it all feels kind of related to him as a person. I have one more question. I am curious about, just going back to sort of this idea of legacy, are there artists that you see responding to Roy's work and in so many different ways? I'd be curious to know a little bit I can name a few. Jeff Koons, Ed Ruscha, George Boslitz, David Hockney, David Sally, Adam McEwen, Louise Lawler, Hank Willis Thomas. The list goes on and on. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on sort of the next generation of artists who are responding to the work.
I think of it generationally. Even among that list, there's peers of Lichtenstein. There's sort of the next generation, like pictures generation artists who are responding to media in a really different perspective. And then maybe like younger artists. And so in writing the sculpture essay, that was sort of where I wanted to end. Like who is the artist who I thought was really continuing at least the sculptural legacy. And it actually took a while for me to kind of think of that person or discover that person. And then like the whole, I don't know if it was a controversy, but Hank Willis Thomas's The Embrace was installed in Boston Common. And maybe you've all heard of it, but I'll just mention it's a memorial to Martin Luther King and to the civil rights movement. But formally, it's just a number of arms, these disembodied arms, hands kind of up to the shoulder. And it's taken from a photograph of King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, hugging after he just received like the Nobel Prize. And so it's fascinating to me how an artist could take a photograph and turn it into not just a sculpture, because people have been doing that since the 19th century, but to turn it into such a fully 3-dimensional sculpture and to really figure out like what the back would be and to put it into the round. And people had mixed feelings about it, whether it was successful or not. And I think because the fact that it was like a tough sculpture too, it wasn't something that was a slam dunk, the kind of slow burn that people are going to have to learn to love. And if they don't love it already, kind of felt like it had like a Lichtenstein feel to it too, that there's a lot of, joy and joyfulness in Lichtenstein sculpture, and I think in Hank's sculpture, but there's also like this underlying kind of like toughness and assertiveness and just wanting to push their audiences just a little bit beyond
their comfort zone. And the parallel being also that they're working from discrete two-dimensional images rather than like the whole internet universe and complexity. It's such a different contemporary art world they're in now. I mean, there's so much. I mean, complexity really is the watchword, and the idea of like the reductive simplicity that artists were going for in the 60s, whether they're minimalists or conceptualists or pop artists or, post-painterly abstract artists, it doesn't matter. The one thing they all wanted, like a reduced, focused, singular statement. And artists now, I don't know, don't have that luxury or that privilege because it's just, we're swimming in this incredibly complex, layered multiverse. And so I think it's interesting to me, and when an artist like Hank Willis Thomas kind of carries forward Lichtenstein's drive to try to find that singular image and that singular form, and to, really rigorously think through and work through until you have this, this finished piece.
Totally. Well, I have to say, looking at this picture, I'm thinking about what you're saying about the steam. It's not just the ephemeral in these sculptures that's so wild. It's the basically like intangible, like it's a light beam. I know I'm going to make a sculpture that's about a light beam, and also a glass, of course. There's this whole like saw of like artists trying to paint, a beam of light in a painting, a glass. And now, I'm going to do it as a sculpture. It is like a very odd idea for the subject of a sculpture, I just have to say. And actually the transparency of that is so cool, which I love in the mirror at Gagosian right now. And I would love to see that mirror sculpture. So I worked with the artist Wade Guyton at the Whitney in 2012, and I can't believe it was 11 years ago we did his show in our old building. And he was an artist. He and I spent a lot of time looking at Lichtenstein and Lichtenstein books, reproductions of Lichtenstein paintings that were playing with reproduction. And this one great like Sonnabend catalog from Paris where like the screen, he had like done a screen print, probably, I don't know if it was an offset printed book, probably picturing like a painting of a screen print. It was like, how many like twists can you spin around? And that was like exactly what Wade was thinking about in his work. And a bunch of the friends of mine circa 2006 or 7, not that they made anything look like Lichtenstein, but this other like idea of how images clone themselves or artists deal with them, or like where does the original thing like live or reside, to your point about the pictures generation. And even in his case, paintings that were like these extruded things filling up rooms, that kind of endless feeling of the canvas pulling through the printer. Those entablature paintings of they could go on forever. There is no essential scale to them. You could make one that was like 500 feet long if you had enough canvas. And Gerhard Richter's played with that idea in places long after Lichtenstein. So I may be drawn to that kind of space in his work where that sort of, again, I'll use that word semiotic, like turn, keep spinning, and how many young artists have thought about that today in relation to our contemporary image culture, and where images are like living in all different places and eventually maybe find some physical form.
Well, thank you both very much.